Good morning, everyone. I apologize for the slight delay, but we wanted to make sure we got T's and I's dotted and all those good things. So thank you for your patience. Call this meeting to order. We are going to report out on our deliberations on a number of items, and we're going to start off with the season dates. But Chris, before we start right into the agenda, is there anything else that you wanted to say at this point?
Not at this time.
Sorry, I should have asked if you were. We're just bringing that up now. So Bob, did you have a motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have two motions on season dates. The first motion would be for the commercial fishery season dates for the coast, and it would be from March 15th through November 14th, other than for Area 2A, and I'll take that up in a second motion.
All right. Did you want to just then, is there a seconder for the motion that Bob just tabled? Peter? Thank
March.
you.
So some comments, Mr. Chairman?
Any comments?
Yeah. I recognize that the conference board and the processor advisory board recommended earlier starting dates. However, we have several administrative challenges on the U.S. side. There's uncertainty about whether we can fully process our domestic approval process. Part of that entails many of the boats having to get abstracted titles to the Coast Guard, which is backed up, and they were shut down. And then those have to be submitted to our RAM division in Juneau. And before any quotas are issued, we have to pay our annual tax. So somewhere there's a inbox full of checks, I think. And so all of that has to be processed. I know that there was a wish for an earlier date. I think we had the support for that. But to accommodate the unique situation on the U.S. side, March 15th, I think, is the date we're going to have to go with. That concludes my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much, Bob. Are there any other questions or comments on the motion? Not seeing any. Are there any commissioners?
I have one more motion.
Right, let's deal with the first one, and then we'll come to the second one. Is that okay? We're going to vote on the first one. So is there any opposition to the season dates that Commissioner Alverson proposed? I'm not seeing any opposition. Passes unanimously. Bob, you have another motion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I recommend season dates of 26 June, 10 July, 24 July, 7 August, 21st of August, 4th of September, and 18th September for the Area 2A non-tribal directed fishery. These seasons, I believe, start at 8 a.m. and run for 10 hours.
Thanks very much. Did you have any other further comments on that motion, Bob?
Yes, I have some comments. I appreciate the concerns raised by our commission staff regarding the potential risk and challenges of managing this short duration pulse fishery. We already provided suggestions to the domestic management agencies to develop management measures in coordination with their fleets when we address regulatory proposals. And I encourage the council and stakeholders to work together to describe by the Pacific Council Chair to explore new approaches. The existing regulations provide the commission with the ability to specify season dates. It may be appropriate for the commission to coordinate with domestic management to consider whether additional dates within these timeframes be appropriate. and we expect the commission and domestic management agencies will coordinate. I have one last comment. Our next meeting will likely be in Anchorage, and a lot of the Area 2A directed fishery people probably don't attend. And I think this year we did not get a direct recommendation from the conference board on these season dates. So perhaps our secretariat needs to cattle prod or put something in the minutes of the conference board and PAG to make sure we get that input next year.
Thanks very much, Commissioner Albertson, for the comments. Is there a seconder for the motion? Neil, thank you. Is there any opposition, any opposed to the motion? No, it passes unanimously. Are you ready to move on to the TCUIs? Yeah, if you're going to bring that. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the next item on the agenda is distribution of TCUI. Chris, I think you have a motion for this.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do. Are we going to get the table up on the screen, I believe? I was going to pause here until we get it up there. Are you waiting for me to?
You can go ahead. No,
Oh,
we'll fill it in as
okay.
you speak.
All right, Mr. Chairman. This is a blanket motion to cover all quotas for all regulatory areas. And so it's a little bit lengthy and a little complicated, so I'll do my best not to butcher it. But it basically is to start with an overall TCEY of 38.6 million pounds based on a F47 SPR. And we've generally in the past years worked around the F46. This harvest rate is a little bit more conservative than that, and close to the range, close to the endpoint of the range recommended by the MSAB. I think we have a little bit greater uncertainty in the stock dynamics this year. We've got some hopeful signals, but not certain from the 2011 and 2012 year class. And so I just believe a slightly more precautionary approach is warranted for this year. Within that, and I'll go area by area, there are a couple of concepts, overarching concepts that I'll speak to that are included. First of all is a share-based allocation for regulatory area 2B. And that share is would be defined based on a weighted average that assigns 30% of the weight to the current management procedures targets TCEY distribution and 70% weighted to 2B's recent historical average share of 20%. And that formula will apply for a period of 2019 to 2022 is my intent. And for 2019, that equates to a share of 17.7%. And again, that can fluctuate up or down depending on the current management procedures targets TCEY distribution each year. The second particular aspect of this is a fixed poundage TCEY for IPHC regulatory area 2A, and that is 1.65 million pounds for the same 4-year period, 2019 to 2022. And that would be my intent for 4 years, subject to any substantial conservation concerns that may be identified as we go over that 4-year period. I'll move on. So again, for area 2A, 1.65. For area 2B, comes out to a TCEY of, let's make sure I get this right, 6.83. Thank you, Bob. For area, just a little bit further rationale, for the area 2B percentage, we had a lot of discussions about the recent historical averages for that area versus using the apportionment model. And that was what we believed was a reasonable approach to weighting those two factors moving forward. For 2A, I want to express appreciation for all the participants from 2A, particularly members of the treaty tribes that I have met with extensively and that have provided a tremendous amount of input and rationale and justification for that allocation. And coupled with the input from our staff concerning the status of the halibut stock and trying to fulfill our responsibilities to provide harvest opportunities to all fisheries participants, specifically to support tribal interests in that area, as well as commercial and recreational fishing opportunities in that area. And so for all those reasons, I think that's an appropriate way to move forward. And it is not going to be a conservation concern at that level of harvest. Let me move on to 2C. The recommended TCEY for that area is 6.34, which I believe is the same number that was last year. And based on the apportionment model, it would have been, I believe, closer to 5.5 million pounds. We elected to move some of the fish from the other U.S. management areas into 2C to get them back to the level, to get that area back to the level it was the previous year, basically in the interest of stability and so consistent with some of the IMSAB recommendations we've had about trying to reduce variability to within some percentage, 15% year to year. So we felt it was appropriate to move a little bit of fish out of 3A, I believe, out of 4B, as well as a small amount out of 4C, D, and E, in order to get Area 2C to a level of 6.34 million pounds. For Area 3A, TCY of 13.5. I believe this is going to result in a catch limit of about 10.2 million pounds, which is an increase relative to 2018. I think that it was a reflection of the increasing proportion of the 032 survey amounts in that area and accommodates our general approach to limit the amount of increase or decrease in regulatory areas between years. It's also consistent with, all of these I think are fairly consistent with recommendations we received from the PAB and the conference board. Within that, and I'll speak to the, in both 3A and I guess in 2C, the charter halibut management measures. I don't know if I need to back up here a second. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I have too many pieces of paper here.
We can fill that in when we talk about regulatory proposals afterwards.
Yeah, we can circle back to that. Charter management measures within that.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris.
Just moving on, I wasn't quite through the list, Mr. Chairman. For Area 3B, it includes TCEY of 2.9 million pounds, which I believe results in a catch limit of 2.3. For Area 4A, TCEY of 1.94, resulting in a catch limit of 1.65. I think that's an increase relative to 2018 of 11%. The Area 4B is a TCEY of 1.45 million pounds and a resulting catch limit of 1.21, I believe. And finally, for Area 4C, D, and E, a TCEY of 4.0 million pounds. And that's the sum of my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was a lot to a lot to go through, and appreciate you doing that. Is there any discussion around the motion? Not seeing anyone. Is there a seconder? Peter, thank you. Any opposed? No, it passes unanimously.
If I might, just a comment, Mr. Chairman, and I guess before we close the meeting, we'll have an opportunity to make closing comments, and if so, I'll hold off till then, because I did want to speak to more generally the process by which we arrived at this, in the discussions that we've had, both with the industry and amongst ourselves, but I'll hold off on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. I think that'd be a good time, maybe at the end, once we've concluded all this, and then we'll have a chance to have statements. That'd be good. So there are three other items that I'm going to ask Commissioner Davis to go through that the commission has already considered and would like to present to the delegation.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So as part of the discussions around the catch limits and over the past year, we're going to propose a few things here. I don't know, Steve, if you can get the language up for these, but I'll read them off. The first is that the Commission recommends evaluating redefining TCEY to include the U26 component of discard mortalities, including bycatch, as steps towards more comprehensive and responsible management of the resource in coordination with the Secretariat. The intent is that each national party to the treaty would be responsible for counting its U26 mortalities against its collective TCEY. This change would be intended to take effect for TCEYs established at the 2020 annual meeting.
You might be confused from what Neil's reading off to what's on the screen, but we're putting up the correct bullets here in just 1 sec.
So I'll just hold off.
Part of the problem is that we did a lot of work today and yesterday, and so that's why it's taken a little bit of time. So back to you, Neil.
Thank you. So I think I've read the first motion. I'll continue with the second. The Commission recommended that the IPHC Secretariat expand upon the analysis completed in IPHC-2019-AM095 Info 8 paper that was called The Treatment and Effects of Pacific Halibut Discard Mortality or Bycatch in Non-Directed Fisheries Projected for 2019, to be reviewed by the SRB at its next meeting. The objective of this work is to estimate lost yield from bycatch of Pacific halibut in non-directed fisheries for the years of 1991 to 2018. Commission also agreed to continue the development of a work plan to explore methods for improvement of monitoring requirements in directed and non-directed fisheries, and to examine options in each IPHC regulatory area for mitigating the impact of bycatch in one IPHC regulatory area on available harvest in other IPHC regulatory areas. So that's my motion.
Thanks very much, Neil. We were just, again, looking at another item. Is there any discussion around any of these three from commissioners? I'm not seeing any. Yeah, that's the next thing. Seconder.
I'll second that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Are any opposed to these adopting these three particular items? I don't see any opposition, so it passes unanimously. We are now going to move on to the piece that you had up previously on the MSAB recommendations, if you could bring those back up. Excuse me, I was going to speak to these ones. So earlier this week, we've had presentations from Dr. Alan Hicks. We had a presentation from the co-chairs of MSAB as well. And in each one of those pieces of presentations, there was extensive work that's been undertaken by MSAB over, I'm going to say, 5 years to get to this point of providing the commission with some concrete recommendations for our consideration. First off, before getting into them, I'd like to express my appreciation to MSAB for their extensive work on developing the technical tools, but also all the work by the MSAB members that came up with the objectives that each one of the scenarios that were being assessed could be judged against. And if you recall, they fell into two major categories of conservation and also to fishery objectives, with conservation having the highest objective of achievement. And so there was a lot of discussion around those objectives within MSAB, and it wouldn't surprise me if sometime in the future there's fine tuning to those objectives in particular. And Alan spoke of one other one that may be considered in the future around spawning biomass. However, we as commissioners a year ago directed the MSAB to come back with a recommendation to this meeting around a scale or fishing intensity, if you will. And this is what the commission has now endorsed after consideration for the last few days. So the commission endorsed the primary objectives and associated performance metrics used to evaluate the management procedures in the MSE process, and that's detailed in paper AM095-12. The commission agreed with the NSAB recommendation that a coastwide fishing intensity, or SPR, should not be lower than 40 or not higher than 46 with a target SPR of 42 to 43 and with a 30 to 20 harvest control rule. Next, the commission recommended that the MSAB and IPHC Secretariat continue its program of work on the management procedure for the scale portion of the harvest strategy, noting that scale and distribution components will be evaluated and presented no later than at AM097 in 2021 for potential adoption and subsequent implementation as a harvest strategy. SPR of 40% with a fishery target, fishery trigger of 30% and a fishery limit of 20% in the control rule and an annual constraint of 15% to be considered. I think we, as a commission, have dedicated significant resources of staff time to this, and staff of the Secretariat has also brought on additional staff to undertake this work. I first would like to congratulate, maybe I've already said this and repeating it, but I would like to congratulate the staff for the work they've undertaken to get to this step, and as well with the NSAB committee that spent considerable time in developing all the recommendations and also developing of the objectives to manage this fishery. I'll stop there and see if there's any discussion on the motion to adopt these three particular items. Is there a seconder? Is anyone opposed? These pass unanimously. Oh, so we're going to move on. We're just bringing up some other text, and they're around accountabilities for TCEY, which Neil will address.
Okay, so thanks, Mr. Chairman. Two things here. I think we have a good process in place that reports out on the various sources of mortality that occur within each regulatory area each year. What we would like to do with that is more formally have that rolled up so that all of the sources of mortality within a TCEY are reported out on an annual basis against the TCEY that was adopted for that regulatory area. So the first motion is to recommend that the Secretariat report out annually on a regulatory area's catch against the TCEY adopted for each regulatory area. And the second piece, or the second motion, if I can do them together, Mr. Chairman, is to recommend that the Secretariat also develop options for accounting for halibut mortalities associated with the Fishery Independent Setline Survey and other research projects in the definition of the coastwide TCEY, again, so that we are more explicitly accounting for that source of mortality in our annual decision-making about TCEYs.
Thank you, Neil. Is there a seconder for those two motions? Bob, thank you. Any discussion on the motions? Are any opposed to the motions? No, they pass unanimously. We are now going to move on to just recapping the regulatory proposals that we discussed yesterday, just to make sure that everyone had a chance to see what was approved and discussed. I'm going to turn that over to Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just run through the regulatory proposals, just describe for you what the action was that you took. There were 6 regulatory proposals, 3 from the IPHC Secretariat, beginning with proposal A1, which changed the text, proposed changing the text of the regulations in section 4 having to do with fishery limits. The Commission deferred modifications to the regulations format at this time and recommended that the contracting parties undertake a review of these proposed amendments contained in the proposal and to provide feedback for the next interim meeting, IM095. We're hoping to adopt them at the next annual meeting. You did, of course, adopt fishery limits just moments ago, so we'll go past that part. The next regulatory proposal was A2, also from the Secretariat, which proposed fishing periods. You adopted overall fishing period dates for the commercial fisheries, and of 15th of March to the 14th of November, and you specified the fishing period dates for the non-tribal directed commercial fishery in IPHC regulatory area 2A. You also agreed that the fishing period for that fishery should be longer, primarily for safety reasons, and after extensive discussion and noting input from stakeholders and license holders, made no change for this year. The Commission noted the suggestion from the Pacific Fishery Management Council and NOAA Fisheries West Coast Region for a workshop to consider future changes to the IPHC regulatory area to a Pacific halibut fishery management structure in a more holistic way, to include all management partners and to take place as early as spring of this year. The Commission recommended that this workshop take place given the desire for the IPHC to move full management of the fishery from the IPHC, an international fisheries management body, to the relevant domestic agencies. And noting the concerns expressed by Canada about safety issues related to the current management of this derby fishery, the Commission expressed its hope that there will be a proposal for an alternative management approach that addresses safety concerns by the time the Commission reconvenes at next year's annual meeting. If no resolution is in hand by then, the IPHC expects to re-examine what steps it can take to address the issue, including moving to longer fishing periods. The next proposal was from the Secretariat. That was A3, which was minor amendments. The Commission noted and deferred action on this proposal for now, with the same recommendation as for the A1, which was that the contracting parties and the Secretariat undertake a detailed review of these proposed amendments with a view towards adopting them at the next annual meeting. There was one regulatory proposal from the contracting party agencies. That was B1, which had to do with the charter halibut management measures in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A, which you adopted and which were contingent upon the TCEY decisions that you made moments ago. And I'll just summarize what those management measures are. In regulatory area 2C, they are the same as they were last year since the TCEY did not change, and that is a 1 fish daily limit, a reverse slot limit of less than or equal to 38 inches or greater than or equal to 80 inches, and no annual limit. In IPHC regulatory area 3A, the charter halibut management measures are a 2 fish daily bag limit, a maximum size limit of less than or equal to 28 inches on 1 fish, a 4 fish annual limit, Wednesday closures all season, and 5 Tuesday closures between 16 July and 13th of August 2019. Also 1 trip per vessel per day and 1 trip per charter halibut permit per day. And that is the result of proposal B1. There were 2 other regulatory proposals. Proposal C1, which had to do with a TCEY for regulatory area 2A, which you have addressed in your earlier action today. And proposal C2, which proposed an individual quota system for IPHC regulatory area 2A, which you noted and deferred action on. And those are the regulatory proposals and their disposition.
Thanks very much, Steve, for going through that. We just wanted to make sure that everyone had another chance to hear that particular information. There will be a full report that we will be putting out at the end of today. at the end of the day that covers everything that has occurred, just so you know. I noticed a number of people that were taking photographs of the screen, but you will also get a a document that has this all documented for everything that we have discussed so far this morning and a few other items that are to come. So any further discussion on the regulatory proposals by commissioners? No? So then, Dave, I'd like to move on to rules of procedure. There was some changes to the rules of procedure and just wanted to go through that.
Thank you, Chair. And so if we could just have that slide projected, please, the text for the rules of procedure. So you may recall document 20 was provided to the Commission and presented to the various subsidiary bodies throughout the year and to the Conference Board and PAB at this in-session. We had a number of concerns, particularly raised from the Conference Board to some of those edits of a non-editorial nature. The Conference Board has agreed to hold an intersessional working group to consider the rules of procedure in conjunction with the Secretariat for potential presentation to revise their rules of procedure, the terms of reference, at the next annual meeting. As part of that, the Conference Board agreed in principle to include the accreditation procedure as a topic for discussion and potential improvement by the working group. So we've removed all of the contentious elements from those rules of procedure, and the Rev 1 has been provided to you for potential adoption by consensus. Thanks, Chair.
I make a motion that the Commission adopt the revised IPHC rules of procedure with the understanding that Dave just spoke about, that we will receive additional input for the Conference Board rules of procedure during the intersession, and we will consider those at the interim meeting. Is there a seconder for that motion? Thank you, Richard. Are there any opposed? No. So that passes unanimously. Dave, next we're going to go to peer review. Peer review. So you may recall, I think it was now almost 5 years ago, that there was a peer review process for the IPHC, and it wasn't just a peer review for the IPHC, it was for a number of various fishery organizations. And coming out of that peer review, there were quite a number of changes to the way that the IPHC conducts various activities. We are now in the process of undertaking a second peer review, and we think that it's a timely thing to, once you've made some changes, to go back and see what those changes how they have improved the process, or whether there's other things that they need to be considered. So the Commission recommended that the IPHC Secretariat develop terms of reference for a consultant to undertake a peer review of the IPHC Pacific Halibut Stock Assessment for implementation in early 2019. The terms of reference and budget will be endorsed by the Commission intersessionally. The Commission recommended that the IPHC Secretariat finalize terms of reference for expert consultant to undertake a peer review of the IPHC Pacific Halibut MSE for implementation in early November 2019 and July 2020. The terms of reference and budget shall be endorsed by the Commission intersessionally. We don't really need a motion. Yeah. So just wanted to bring those two items to your attention. Next is the calendar. We're just now going to go over the calendar. We will be bringing up a table of showing all the TCUI values for each one of the regulatory areas, and also that it's broken down for further detail. And we're just confirming whether that's completed at this point. So Steve, were you going to walk through the calendar?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as you all are aware, you approve a 3-year calendar for IPHC meetings. And so now we have added the 2021 to the list here. So I will note several things about the calendar before we ask you to approve it for publication. The first of which is if you look over in the 2021 column, you'll see some red. The annual meeting is scheduled to take place in Canada that year. And so we will ask the commissioners to specify the meeting site for the annual meeting, AM097. And then you'll see red marks under the Management Strategy Advisory Board. And that's just listed as TBD because as we've already discussed this morning, the Management Strategy Advisory Board is scheduled to report out its recommendations relative to scale and distribution at the annual meeting in 2021. And so the scope and direction and continuation of the MSE process will be subject to discussion at that point. So we've left those off the calendar for the moment. The only other point about the calendar I'd like to make is that the dates for next year's annual meeting, that's AM096, taking place in Anchorage the week of 27 to 31 January, do conflict with the meeting of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So we'd ask you to consider that as you discuss the calendar and direct us what to do.
All right, thanks for that summary, Steve. We do have a motion for the meeting location in 2021.
Okay, I'm slightly biased on this one, but I'm going to make the motion that we make it in Victoria.
Is there a seconder for that motion, Bob? Thank you very much. Are any opposition to that motion? No, it passes unanimously. And then we can now, we don't have to do anything else, that's just information. This is the chairs is the last item.
The chairs, yeah. And then if you want that table right at the end, we can bring it up.
Yeah. Are there? So we're just conferring about the schedule in particular. There is, as we've agreed, that the 2021 meeting would take place in Victoria. As Steve identified, there is a conflict with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, and we direct the staff to seek some alternative dates and locations potentially, but basically to resolve that conflict so that we can have the 2020 annual meeting. The other item, we still are developing the TCOI table, but we'll have that shortly. Pardon me? Yeah. So is there a motion to approve the calendar? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to approve the calendar.
Is there a seconder? Neil, thank you. Any opposed? No, it passes unanimously. The next item is that we need to identify a chair and vice chair. So is there a motion to identify a chair?
Mr. Chairman, I would move that Chris Oliver be the U.S. chair for 2019.
Is there a seconder? Neil? Neil, thank you. Any opposed? No, passes unanimously. We need to identify a vice chair. Is there a motion for identifying a vice chair? Neil?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that Paul Ryall be nominated as vice chair.
Do we have a seconder?
Second.
Is there any opposition to that? No, passes unanimously. We are going to bring up the table, but before we do that, Chris, you mentioned making some comments. Do you want to do that now? And I had a couple of words to say as well, and then we'll bring up the table. Bob?
So, Mr. Chairman, I had a staff request regarding an issue dealing with abundance-based management before closing comments are made.
I think we're okay without, I mean, it's up to you, Bob. You can if you like, but I think we've agreed that the staff will undertake that work. But if you would like to speak to it, that's fine too.
So the North Pacific Council is developing what they call abundance-based management halibut cap in the Bering Sea. And there is a current cap of 3,515 metric tons. And they're looking to see if that needs to be redone. And once that number is agreed to, that it will supposedly fluctuate with abundance of halibut in the Bering Sea. And there's two indexes they're trying to develop to look at that. It would be the Eastern Bering Sea Trawl Survey done by the National Marine Fisheries Service and our own setline survey in the Bering Sea. And apparently Dr. Hicks and the Halibut Commission have developed a model that tests that. And I would ask that our staff, Dr. Wilson, attempt to run the simulation models of weighting the two against each other or individually and report back to us as commissioners as to the recommendation. And so that's it.
All right, thanks very much, Bob, for providing that explanation for some work that we've asked the IPHC Secretariat to develop. I think it would be a good opportunity for the commissioners to address the delegation. I don't know if you want me to go first or you want to go first, Chris? Doesn't really matter.
I'll go, Mr. Chairman, and I just wanted to make a few brief comments. I want to express my appreciation to Canada and to the Commission staff, to the Canadian commissioners for hosting this meeting, and for all of the incredible, excellent support from the administrative staff to the scientific staff. We have an excellent team of people, and I'm proud to be part of that. I want to speak to the process by which we reached resolution this week and were able to adopt a number of items, importantly our catch limits across regulatory areas. Based on our inability to reach consensus last year and coming into this meeting, based on some of the preliminary meetings that we had, I was somewhat fearful, skeptical that we would be able to reach a conclusion at this meeting. I was very eager to do so because I feel like if we had come out of this meeting again with an inability to reach consensus, that it would be extremely negative in terms of, frankly, the reputation of this international management body and to the implications to our numerous constituents. And I can say that throughout the discussions that we've had over the past few months, as well as the numerous discussions that we have had this week, I've come to have a greater, deeper understanding of all things halibut, having been out of the process for a year or so, and a greater understanding and appreciation for the issues of concern that you have with, for example, the apportionment, other aspects of how those TCYs have been arrived at it, and for your rationale and justifications for where those percentages have been on TCYs have been set over the past several years. And I think you two have gained a better understanding of some of the concerns we had with that. And I just want to say that those discussions that we had were always cordial and respectful and sometimes even humorous. And I can't express how pleased I am. I think it's a hugely significant success on our part. How pleased I am that we were able to come to what I think is a very reasonable, very fair compromise, both in terms of our overall harvest strategy as well as our distributions among regulatory areas. And I just want to express my deep appreciation to you, Paul, and to Neil, and to Pete, and my fellow commissioners, Bob and Rich, for being able to reach that conclusion. Very much appreciate it, and I look forward to working with further work that we committed to, that was part of Neil's motion with regard to bycatch and monitoring and the U-26 issue. And I expect and trust that we will work closely as necessary with the U.S. and the Canadian governments and the contracting parties in coordinating that work. So again, thank you very much. And I think we had a fantastic meeting. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. And you said almost everything that I was going to say, but I'm going to repeat a little bit of it for sure. I must admit, it was disappointing last year to not reach agreement. As I've said a number of times, we've had this commission for almost 100 years, and that's a relatively long time for a fishery commission, if you will. In fact, it's my understanding it's the first treaty that Canada ever signed as a country. We had to kick the British out, actually, but and it's ironic we're in Victoria, but it was the first treaty that was signed by the country of Canada, and so in not reaching agreement was troubling, not just because it was the first treaty, but because of trying to figure out how we do share this resource that goes from California all the way up into Alaska. Since the annual meeting last year, we had, I think, at least 9 meetings, and we also asked the staff to develop quite a bit of information to help us better understand each other's perspective, each other's country's perspective on the issues and facing us, not just around the shares, but also how we're managing the resource. So for that, I thank the staff for getting all that information together in very short order. Some of it just before Christmas, some of it just after. I do think, as we've identified, that this is a 4-year agreement as well. And so with that, I think it provides some stability to the fishermen, but also to how we think about how we undertake stock assessments and how we can now dedicate some of the time we spend on negotiation on moving our thoughts and efforts towards that. So as Chris identified, we did have very frank discussions, some of them challenging, but in my view, they were always cordial and respectful. And as Chris said, sometimes they were quite funny. So I totally agree with Chris. I think we've come up with a reasonable, fair outcome for both parties, and look forward to working with all the parties and you as delegation going forward. So thanks very much. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I think everything that needs to be said about the decisions that have been undertaken over the course of this week have been said. And so I'll keep my comments very simple, and essentially it's just to reiterate the thanks for all of the stakeholders who've been engaged through this process, not only throughout this year, but in the many previous years leading up to where the IPHC finds itself, having just passed its 95th anniversary. And most of the good work that we do is facilitated by the staff at the Secretariat. You know many of them, and there are others who are back in the office who you may not be quite so familiar with. But they certainly put in a tremendous effort to ensure that this is a successful meeting, and all of the subsidiary bodies and everything else we do throughout the year is a success. So if I could just have a round of applause for all of the Secretariat staff who've supported this process.
Yes, so the last remaining item is that we're going to bring up the total TCEY table. I don't think there's anything particular. Yeah, so we're just going to leave this up. And as I mentioned, we will be having a report out by the end of today. There will also be a news release that will cover off the main highlights. And with that, unless there's any further discussion or comments from commissioners, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. So thank you again. We'll see you in a year from now.